The wind howled like a beast outside, slamming against the glass windows of the old roadside diner. Snowflakes the size of coins swirled through the night, covering the highway in a blanket of white. The neon sign of Red Maple Diner flickered desperately against the storm, casting a lonely red glow on the snow-drenched ground. Inside, the world was warmer, but only slightly. Katherine wiped her tired hands on the red-checkered apron she wore over her black shirt. Her shift was supposed to have ended 2 hours ago, but her colleague had called in sick. That meant she was alone. Again. She glanced at the clock above the counter. Midnight. The silence was almost eerie. Only the humming of the old coffee machine and the occasional creak of the wooden door broke the stillness. She sighed. Who would even come out in this storm? Her hands trembled slightly as she refilled the coffee pot. Not from the cold, but from exhaustion. Bills were piling up. Her mother's medical treatment was overdue, and her landlord had given her a final warning. Rent was due in 3 days. Katherine had grown used to swallowing her pain and hiding it behind a smile for customers who rarely noticed her. But tonight, it seemed there would be no customers, until the door suddenly banged open. Katherine nearly jumped, the coffee pot shaking in her hands. 15 men walked in, one after another. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing heavy coats dusted with snow. Their shoes echoed sharply on the diner's old floor as they entered like a storm within the storm. They weren't ordinary men. Even in their travel-worn state, there was an air of power around them, the kind that made people instinctively step aside. Katherine's eyes widened. They looked like businessmen straight out of some high-profile magazine. But what on earth were they doing here, in a half-forgotten diner in the middle of nowhere? The man at the front, a sharp-faced gentleman with silver hair and piercing eyes, spoke first. "Is this place open?" His voice carried authority. Katherine forced a smile. "Yes. Yes, it's open, please. Have a seat." The men filled the red leather booths, their presence so overwhelming that the small diner suddenly felt too tight. They shed their coats, revealing expensive suits beneath. Their watches glimmered under the neon light. It was a surreal sight. 15 men who looked like they belonged in a boardroom in New York, now huddled in a dusty roadside diner in the middle of a snowstorm. Katherine hurried to bring menus, though she doubted men like them cared much for greasy fries or pancakes. Her hands were shaking slightly as she placed the menus down. That was when she noticed him. He was sitting at the far corner, apart from the others. Unlike the rest, who seemed restless and impatient, this man was calm. His eyes, dark, unreadable, followed her movements quietly. His presence was heavier than all the others combined, though he hadn't spoken a word. Galsp, that was his name. She didn't know it yet, but she could feel there was something about him, something that made her heart skip, though she couldn't explain why. The men began ordering, coffee, soup, whatever was hot. Their voices overlapped, commanding yet oddly vulnerable, as though stripped of their power by the storm outside. Katherine scribbled quickly on her notepad, her tired feet already aching at the thought of serving them all alone. But then something unexpected happened. When she returned with steaming coffee pots and trays of bowls, one of the men chuckled. "A waitress working alone on a night like this? Either you're brave or crazy," Katherine smiled faintly. "Maybe both," laughter rippled across the booth. For a moment, the tension eased. These men, who carried the weight of empires on their shoulders, were drinking weak diner coffee and laughing at a waitress's joke. But not Glalsp. He only watched her. His expression unreadable. His fingers tapped the table softly, like a man lost in thought. Katherine tried to ignore his gaze, but every time her eyes wandered back, he was still watching. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but as if he was searching for something. The storm outside grew worse. Wind howling, snow piling higher. Inside the diner, Katherine moved between tables with her worn smile, serving soup, refilling cups, and listening quietly to pieces of conversation she didn't understand. Stock markets, mergers, power deals. Words from another world, but little did she know. That night, in the middle of a storm, she had given shelter not to customers, but to 15 of the world's most powerful billionaires. And among them, the quiet man in the corner, Glosp, was about to change her life forever. The diner's heater struggled against the cold, humming loudly, but it was enough to create a pocket of warmth. The storm outside had turned the world into white chaos. Cars were buried, roads invisible. It was as if fate itself had pushed these 15 men into Katherine's small world. The booths were filled with deep voices, the smell of coffee and steam rising from bowls of soup. Katherine moved between them gracefully, her red-checkered apron swaying as she carried trays heavier than her strength should allow. She placed steaming bowls on the tables with practiced ease, her tired smile never leaving her lips. "You really work here alone?" one of the men asked, disbelief in his tone. He was in his late 40s, with slicked-back hair and a diamond watch that caught the diner's neon glow. Katherine nodded. "Most nights, yes. People don't usually come out this late, especially not in weather like this," the man chuckled. "Well, you got lucky tonight." "Or maybe we got lucky," the table laughed, but Katherine simply smiled politely, not knowing how true those words would become. At another booth, 2 men whispered, their tones hushed but intense. The meeting's postponed. The storm grounded every jet on the East Coast. Still, if the press finds out 15 of us are stuck together in the same place, it'll be chaos. Katherine's brows furrowed slightly as she refilled their cups. "Who exactly are these men?" she wondered. Their words carried weight, as though they weren't just businessmen but men who moved the world with their decisions. But she didn't ask. She had learned long ago, customers appreciated silence more than curiosity. Yet one man broke that silence. From the corner booth, the quiet one spoke at last. His voice was deep, calm, carrying authority without trying. "You've been working since morning, haven't you?" Katherine turned, startled. He hadn't spoken before. His eyes were locked on hers, steady and unreadable. "Yes," she said softly. "Double shift. Why?" His tone wasn't rude, but curious. Katherine hesitated, her lips pressing together before she answered. "Because bills don't pay themselves. And my mother, she's sick. Treatment isn't cheap." For a moment, silence fell. Some of the men glanced at her, surprised that she had spoken so honestly. Most waitresses they encountered kept conversations light, surface level, but Katherine had no energy left for pretense. The man, Gillespie, watched her a moment longer, then nodded. "Honest answer." "Rare thing," Katherine blinked, unsure how to respond. She gave a small smile and turned back to the counter, though her heart beat strangely faster. The others noticed too. One of them leaned toward Gloss with a smirk. "You never talk, but suddenly the waitress gets your attention?" Gillespie ignored the teasing. He kept his gaze on the window, watching the snow. Though his mind wasn't on the storm, he had seen hundreds of faces in his life, people chasing his approval, flattering him for deals or fearing him for his power. But Katherine's tired eyes, her quiet strength, the way she served with dignity despite exhaustion, there was something different. "Hey, sweetheart," another man called to Katherine as she passed by. "What would you do if one of us handed you a blank check tonight?" Laughter followed, loud and sharp. Katherine froze for half a second, then forced a small laugh. "I'd probably frame it and hang it in my kitchen. At least then I'd remember the night I survived a snowstorm with 15 strangers." Her answer was light, but her eyes shimmered with something deeper. The men looked at each other, some amused, some thoughtful. Gillespie's gaze, however, softened. She wasn't greedy. She wasn't trying to impress. She had given them warmth, food, and shelter without knowing or caring who they really were. Time passed. The diner clock ticked past 2 a.m. The storm showed no sign of ending. The billionaires, used to luxury hotels and private jets, found themselves dozing in cramped booths, their heads leaning against each other, ties loosened, coffee cups empty. For the first time in years, some of them looked human. Katherine, though exhausted, placed extra blankets she kept for late-night truckers around their shoulders. She dimmed the lights slightly, creating a quiet peace inside. When she reached Glosp's booth, she hesitated. He was still wide awake, his eyes watching her carefully. "You should rest too," he said quietly. Katherine smiled faintly. "Waitresses don't rest," he tilted his head. "Everyone deserves rest." For a moment their eyes held, her weary but kind. his intense but unreadable. Then she turned, her footsteps soft against the floor as she walked back to the counter. Gillespie's hand tapped the table once. A decision was forming in his mind. This wasn't just any waitress. And this wasn't just any night. The storm outside had buried the world in silence. Snow climbed the diner's glass windows, blurring the outside view into a wall of white. Inside, the heater groaned and hissed, barely keeping the cold away. The billionaires had settled into an uneasy calm. Some had dozed off in their booths, their expensive coats bundled around them like shields. Others sat with coffee cups in hand, their sharp business minds still calculating even in the dead of night. Katherine, however, didn't rest. Her tired feet moved from counter to table, adjusting blankets, refilling coffee, collecting empty dishes. She wasn't sure why she cared so much. These men weren't her responsibility. They weren't truck drivers or travelers who had stumbled into her diner. They looked like men who could buy and sell the whole town in a single meeting. And yet, here they were, dependent on her warmth, her food, her shelter. She paused for a moment by the counter, staring at the steam curling from the coffee pot. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. Pale, coughing, trying to hide her pain. The doctor's words rang in her ears. If you can't afford the treatment soon, it may be too late. Katherine swallowed hard. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry at work anymore, but she didn't know that someone was watching. Gillespie sat in the corner booth, untouched coffee cooling in front of him. His eyes followed her every movement, reading what others couldn't. Where others saw just a waitress, he saw the weight she carried in her quiet resilience. Finally, he spoke again. His voice cut through the silence like a low note of music. What's her name? Katherine turned, startled. Excuse me? Your mother, Gillespie clarified. His gaze didn't waver. Katherine blinked. Nobody ever asked her questions like that. Customers wanted food, not stories. For a moment, she wanted to brush it off with a joke. But his eyes, they made her feel like she didn't have to pretend. Margaret, she said softly. She was a nurse, spent her life helping people. Now she's too sick to help herself. A silence followed. Some of the men in nearby booths, half asleep, stirred at her words. Gillespie's fingers tapped once on the table. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. And you're paying for it all. Alone. Katherine gave a faint, tired laugh. There's no one else. My father's gone. My brother walked out years ago. It's just me. One of the other men across the diner whistled quietly. Tough girl. Another leaned back in his booth, smirking. Or foolish. Working herself to the bone for something she might never afford. Katherine stiffened, her smile faltering for the first time that night. But before she could reply, Gillespie's eyes snapped toward the man who spoke. Enough. The word was simple, but it carried such authority that the room fell silent. The billionaire who had mocked her looked away instantly, muttering under his breath. Katherine glanced at Gillespie, surprised. She couldn't understand why he, out of all of them, would defend her. She whispered, "You didn't have to do that." Gillespie's eyes met hers again, steady, unreadable. I don't like cheap men making fun of honest work. Her breath caught for a moment. She quickly turned back to the counter, her heart racing in a way she couldn't explain. The night grew deeper. The clock struck 3 a.m. The diner was wrapped in stillness. The billionaires one by one drifted into uneasy sleep, their arrogance stripped away by exhaustion. Only Gillespie remained awake, his gaze fixed on the snow outside, his thoughts elsewhere. He wasn't like the others. Unlike them, he didn't laugh too loud, didn't boast about wealth or power. He sat quietly, observing, measuring. To the others it looked like detachment. But inside, Gillespie's mind was a storm of its own, because he knew who Katherine was. He remembered her father. Years ago, her father had been one of the most loyal men in his company. A man who had been betrayed, silenced, and left to disappear from the corporate world. And now here was his daughter, working night shifts, carrying debts, caring for a sick mother, while the world forgot her family's name. Fate had a strange way of weaving paths. Gillespie's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this night to matter. He hadn't expected a waitress to stir something in him, but as he watched her move, Weary yet graceful, carrying burdens with quiet strength. One thought formed in his mind. This woman doesn't belong in the shadows. She deserves more, and before the storm was over, he would make sure she got it. The following weeks felt like a dream for me. Snow melted, spring crept in, but the memory of that stormy night never left me. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night, replaying it in my mind, the cold wind, the frozen roads, the fear in their eyes when they entered the diner, and the relief when I brought them warmth. But then, reality would whisper, 15 billionaires sat in my diner. They could have gone anywhere, but fate brought them to me. I didn't tell anyone in the town. Who would believe it? To them, I was still just Katherine, the waitress. The girl who poured coffee, smiled politely, and swept the floors after closing. But Mr. Glasp's promise echoed in my head. The world will remember your kindness. One morning, a letter arrived in my name. The envelope was thick, embossed with gold initials. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was an invitation. Miss Katherine, you are cordially invited to a private dinner in New York City, hosted by the Global Business Council. Transportation will be provided. Attire, formal, I nearly dropped it. That was the Council of Billionaires, the same group I had sheltered. When the black limousine pulled up in front of my little apartment a week later, the whole neighborhood stared. Children pointed, mothers whispered, and old Mr. Harris from the bakery almost tripped over his flour sack. The driver, in a crisp uniform, stepped out and opened the door for me. Miss Katherine, we've been expecting you. My heart pounded as we drove past the fields, the factories, and finally into the glowing heart of the city. Skyscrapers reached into the clouds, lights sparkled like stars, and I felt so small, yet chosen. At the dinner, the hall was filled with the richest, most powerful people in the world. Journalists, photographers, and investors all gathered. But when I walked in, silence fell. People turned. Some whispered, "Who is she?" And then Mr. Glasp in his sharp black tuxedo rose from his seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his deep voice carrying across the room, "you see this woman? Her name is Katherine. On the night of the great snowstorm, when even our power and wealth meant nothing, she opened her door. She gave us shelter, food, warmth, without asking who we were, without seeking anything in return. That night she reminded us of what humanity truly means." Applause thundered. Cameras flashed. My eyes burned with tears. But then he turned back to me with a look that made my breath catch. "Katherine, you changed more lives that night than you realize. And tonight, we want to change yours." A man handed me a velvet box. Inside was not jewelry, not money, but a key. "To what?" I asked softly. Glasp smiled. "You'll see tomorrow." The next morning, when the convoy of 135 luxury cars pulled up in front of my diner, I nearly fainted. Rolls-Royces, Lamborghinis, Ferraris, all lined up, engines humming, paint glistening in the sun. Each one carried a gift. Some were deeds to properties. Some were investments in my name. Some were lifetime shares in billion-dollar companies. And at the very front stood Glasp, holding the key I had seen last night. "Katherine," he said, his voice gentle now, "this isn't charity. This is gratitude. You gave us something money could never buy. So we give you the means to never have to struggle again." The crowd gasped as he pointed to a tall, glass building nearby, its name newly engraved in shining letters, Katherine Foundation for Humanity. I couldn't breathe. My knees shook as tears spilled down my cheeks. Me, a waitress from a small-town diner, now had a foundation in my name, funded by billionaires, built to help others. And as the flashbulbs popped, as the world watched, Glasp leaned closer and whispered, "This is just the beginning, Katherine. The world will know your story, but I hope one day you'll let me be part of it too." His words weren't just gratitude. They carried something deeper, something I wasn't ready to admit yet, but my heart already knew. Life after that day was no longer the same. Overnight, my name, Katherine, the waitress who sheltered billionaires in a snowstorm, was on every newspaper headline, every television screen, every online article. People I had served coffee to for years now looked at me differently. Some with pride, some with envy, but most with disbelief. How could the girl who once counted tips to pay rent suddenly be sitting among billionaires? But I reminded myself, this wasn't about money. This was about the moment that changed everything. The foundation, bearing my name, opened its doors to the public within months. It became a place where struggling families found hope, where children received education, where the homeless found shelter. The same warmth I gave on that stormy night now spread to thousands. Every time I walked through its glass doors, I would remember that night, the snow, the flickering diner lights, the silence that filled the room before I brought out hot coffee and soup. And always, standing beside me was Glasp. He wasn't just another billionaire.
Beneath his sharp suits and commanding presence was a man who carried loneliness,
Who had built empires but lost touch with simple human kindness until that night. We started talking more. Not about money or foundations, but about life, about small things. His favorite childhood meal, my dream of seeing the ocean, the way both of us secretly loved the quiet of small-town streets. One evening, months later, he visited the old diner. It was closed now, but I still had the keys. We sat inside, at the same booth where he had once sat shivering in the storm. I poured us both coffee, just like before. He looked at me, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen. "Katherine, that night, you saved more than just our lives. You saved something inside me that I thought I had lost." I swallowed hard, my heart beating too fast. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly. "You reminded me that even in a world built on power and wealth, kindness is the only thing that makes us human. And since that night, there's only one thing I've been sure of. I don't just want to thank you. I want to walk the rest of this journey with you." The diner was silent. My hand shook around the coffee cup, and then for the first time I let my heart speak. "Glasp, that night I didn't know who you were, but I saw the fear in your eyes, the way you looked at me when I handed you that first bowl of soup. And since then I've felt something too, maybe. Fate brought you to me." His hand reached across the table, covering mine, strong, steady, warm. Outside, snow began to fall again, like a memory returning. Months later, when the world gathered again for the first gala of the Katherine Foundation, Glasp stood beside me on the grand stage, not just as the billionaire everyone admired, but as the man who had found his heart in a storm. And when he took my hand in front of the cameras, the applause was louder than thunder. But for me, it wasn't the applause that mattered. It was the truth that life had taught me, that one act of kindness can change the course of history, that even a waitress in a forgotten diner can shake the world, and that sometimes, in the coldest storms, destiny writes the warmest love stories, the end.